Even if you have never been to Detroit, even if you have never set foot in Michigan, you have almost certainly seen the photographs. They circulate on the internet with a regularity that borders on ritual, shared and reshared, appearing in articles about urban decay and American decline, in the passage of time, in the cruelty of industrial capitalism, and the strange beauty that ruin produces when nature starts to reclaim what humans have abandoned. The photographs show a building so large it is hard to comprehend its scale from a single image. Floors caved in, ceilings collapsed, trees growing up through what used to be an assembly floor, their roots splitting the concrete, their branches reaching toward holes in the roof where the sky comes through in shafts of gray, Michigan light. Graffiti on every surface, metal stripped from every structure that had metal worth stripping. Glass gone from every window frame for decades. The whole thing open to the weather, open to whatever Detroit winter wants to do to it, open to every season for so long that the seasons have become part of the architecture. That building is the Packard Automotive Plant on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit, Michigan. It is 3.5 million square feet, 40 buildings connected into a single complex stretching across 35 acres in what was once one of the most productive manufacturing corridors in the history of human industry. It stopped making cars in 1956. It has been sitting in various states of collapse and ruin ever since, for longer than many of the people photographing it have been alive. And the company whose name it bears, Packard, is gone so completely that many of the people who walk through that building looking for the perfect photograph have only a vague idea of what Packard actually was. They know it was a car company. They know it was in Detroit. They know something went wrong. What they don't know is that Packard was not just a car company. For the first half of the 20th century, Packard was the car. Not one of the prestigious cars, not a respected luxury mark. The car. The object that the wealthiest and most powerful people in America specified when they wanted to communicate, without ambiguity, that they had arrived at the highest level of success that the country offered. Presidents rode in Packards. Royalty ordered Packards. Movie stars were photographed stepping out of Packards. Generals were driven to the front in Packards. And then it was gone. Not gradually, not gracefully, not in the way that some great things diminish slowly over time until their absence is barely noticed. Packard collapsed with a speed and a completeness that shocked even the people inside the company who could see it coming. One decade, the most prestigious automobile brand in America. The next decade, a historical footnote. The decade after that, nothing at all. How does that happen? How does something that dominant, that trusted, that embedded in the culture of American aspiration and American success, simply cease to exist? That is the story. And to tell it properly, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to before there was a Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard. Back to before there was much of anything on East Grand Boulevard at all. It is 1899, Warren, Ohio. Two brothers named James and William Packard have built a small manufacturing business making electrical equipment. James, the older of the two, is 36 years old and has recently purchased one of the early automobiles produced by Alexander Winton, who was at that point one of the most prominent figures in the nascent American automobile industry. The car keeps breaking down. James keeps having to return it for repairs. After one too many frustrating visits, according to the story that has been told many times, and maybe at least partially true, Alexander Winton tells James Packard that if he thinks he can do better, he should try. James Packard went home and built a car. The first Packard automobile rolled out of the Packard Brothers Ohio Automobile Company shop in November of 1899. It was, by the standards of what existed at that moment, a serious and well-engineered machine. Not flashy, not fast, but reliable, competently built, and thought through with an attention to quality that reflected the Packard's manufacturing background. They were not dreamers building something because they loved speed or adventure. They were engineers and businessmen building something because they believed they could build it better than what currently existed. That disposition, the commitment to engineering quality above all other considerations, would define Packard for the next 5 decades, for better and ultimately for worse. The company moved to Detroit in 1903. This was not an unusual decision for that moment. Detroit in 1903 was where the American automobile industry was consolidating, for reasons that had to do with its access to raw materials, its existing manufacturing infrastructure, its proximity to the Great Lakes shipping network, and the presence of a particular concentration of mechanical and engineering talent that had been drawn there by the industry's growth. Henry Ford was in Detroit. Ransom Olds was in Detroit. The Dodge brothers were in Detroit. The whole cast of characters who would build the American automobile century was gathering in that one city in those early years of the 20th century, and Packard joined them. A man named Henry Joy, from a wealthy Detroit family, had become an investor in the Packard company and effectively took control of the business side of it, allowing James Packard to focus on the engineering. Joy was an important figure in the company's early direction because he understood something that pure engineers sometimes miss: that a great product is not enough if it is not positioned correctly in the market, if it is not priced correctly, if it is not sold to the right people in the right way. Joy made a decision that would define Packard's identity for the next 5 decades. He decided the company would build expensive cars, not affordable cars, not middle-market cars, not cars for the growing working and middle class that was beginning to be able to afford automobiles as prices came down. Packard would build luxury cars, the best cars, cars that cost more than almost anyone could afford and were worth every dollar of it. This was, in the early 1900s, a defensible and intelligent strategy. The automobile was new. The technology was expensive. The manufacturing was craft-intensive. Mass production techniques were in their earliest stages. If you were going to build cars by hand with skilled craftsmen at low volumes, you needed to charge prices that reflected that reality. High prices required wealthy customers, and wealthy customers, once they had decided to purchase a motor car, wanted something that reflected their status and their taste. Packard gave them that, and then some. The cars that came out of the Packard factory in the first 2 decades of the 20th century were genuine engineering achievements. Powerful engines built to tolerances that most manufacturers weren't achieving. Bodies designed with an elegance and restraint that distinguished them from the more flamboyant European luxury cars. Interiors finished with materials, wool, leather, wood, that were selected and fitted with a care that you could see and feel, and that lasted for years in ways that cheaper materials did not. And they were reliable. This was not a small thing in an era when automobiles frequently broke down and left their owners stranded on unpaved roads miles from the nearest mechanic. Packard's engineering culture produced cars that you could depend on, that started when you needed them to start, that did not strand you. For a wealthy businessman who needed to get somewhere, or a family that was traveling a significant distance, reliability was not a luxury feature. It was the most important feature of all. The reputation built quickly and solidly. By the early 1910s, Packard had established itself as the finest American automobile. Not one of the finest. The finest. The one you specified when you wanted the best, and the price was not the primary consideration. By the 1910s and into the 1920s, Packard had developed what became its most iconic design language. The cars of this era, the Twin 6, the Single 8, the early 12s, had a look that was unmistakably Packard. A certain proportion in the body, a certain stance, a certain formal dignity that communicated seriousness and permanence rather than sportiness or flash. The radiator shell, upright and imposing. The long hood covering an engine that was both powerful and smooth. The bodywork sweeping back from that hood in lines that were elegant without being showy. A Packard looked like it belonged to someone important, someone whose importance was not in question and did not need to be announced with ostentation. That look and the reputation behind it made Packard the choice of a specific stratum of American society. The genuinely multi-generationally wealthy, the corporate leaders, the politicians at the highest levels, the professionals who had achieved the very pinnacle of their fields. When you saw a Packard on the street in 1920 or 1925 or 1930, you knew something specific and unambiguous about whoever was in it. President after president rode in Packards. Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. The presidential limousines of this era were Packards, built specifically for government service, armored and modified for official use, but instantly recognizable as the same cars available to private buyers. When you put the President of the United States in a car, you are making a statement about that car. You are saying this is the best we have. This is what the most powerful person in the country rides in. The foreign orders told the same story. European royalty, heads of state from across the world, the wealthiest individuals in countries that had their own fine automobile traditions, these people ordered Packards. In an era when European luxury cars like Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benz set the standard that everyone else aspired to, Packard was the American answer. Not an imitation of European luxury, but a distinct American expression of it. Somewhat less ornate, somewhat more engineering-focused, but completely serious and completely credible at the highest level. Al Capone famously had a Packard, several of them, actually, heavily modified with armor plating and thick glass. The fact that the most prominent organized crime figure of the Prohibition era chose Packards for his personal fleet is a data point about the brand's status that cuts in an interesting direction. It says something about what Packard represented to anyone who had achieved the kind of power that required both protection and projection. Through the 1920s, the company thrived. The decade was good to American luxury goods in general. The prosperity of the Roaring Twenties flowed most visibly to the wealthy, and the wealthy spent. Packard's sales were strong. The plant on East Grand Boulevard, which had been designed by the great industrial architect Albert Kahn and built in phases starting from 1903, was one of the most advanced manufacturing facilities in the world. Kahn's reinforced concrete construction was a revelation. Fireproof, durable, with large windows that let in the natural light that craftsmen needed to do precise work. The plant was functional and rational and built to last, and for the first several decades of the 20th century, it produced cars that earned the company's reputation every time they rolled off the line. And then came 1929. The Great Depression hit the luxury automobile market with a particular ferocity. The wealthy were not immune to the crash. Many of them lost fortunes. Many of those who kept their fortunes became acutely conscious of the optics of conspicuous consumption at a time when millions of Americans were standing in bread lines. A new Packard, 12 in 1932 or 1933, cost several $1,000s, at a time when a skilled factory worker made a few $100s a year. Buying one was not just an expense, it was a statement. And in the early 1930s, it was a statement that many of Packard's traditional customers were unwilling to make publicly, even if they could afford to. Sales collapsed. This is the moment where Packard made the decision that saved the company in the short term and destroyed it in the long term. The executives looked at the collapsing sales of their high-end cars and made a logical decision. They would introduce a less expensive line, a Packard that more people could afford. Not a cheap car, still a quality automobile, still a Packard, but priced to reach the broader upper-middle-class market rather than only the genuinely wealthy. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120. It sold for around $1,000, which was dramatically less than the $4,000 and $5,000 and $6,000 price tags on the senior Packards. And it sold well, very well. The Packard name still meant something. People who could not afford the full luxury Packard experience were happy to buy a 120 and drive something that said Packard on the hood. In 1937, Packard introduced the 6, even more affordable, and the sales numbers climbed further. The company was saved. The Depression was navigated. The balance sheet stabilized. But something else had happened. Something that couldn't be seen in the quarterly numbers, but that was corrosive in a way that would compound for the next 20 years. The Packard name had been attached to cars that were not the finest American automobiles. They were good cars, solid, reliable, well-made cars. But they were not what Packard had spent 30 years building its reputation on. They were not the cars that presidents rode in and foreign royalty ordered, and successful men bought to communicate that they had reached the absolute top. The people who had been Packard's core customers, the genuinely wealthy, the ones who bought a Packard because it was unambiguously the finest. Those people started looking at the 120 and the 6 and asking themselves whether the car they were driving still said what they had always counted on it to say. It did not say the same thing anymore. How could it? When the same name was on a $1,000 car available to anyone who could scrape together the payments, it could not simultaneously signal what it had signaled when it was on a $5,000 car that only a small fraction of the population could ever consider. This problem, the dilution of the brand, did not kill Packard immediately. Through the late 1930s, the company was profitable and active and still producing genuine luxury cars alongside the more accessible lines. World War II then gave the company a different kind of mission entirely. Packard's engineering capability was put to work producing Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engines under license for the Allied Air Forces, the engines that powered the P-51 Mustang and other critical aircraft. Packard's manufacturing precision was exactly what the war effort needed, and the company performed that work with distinction. But the war, while it kept the factories running and the engineers occupied, also interrupted the development of the peacetime car program in ways that would matter enormously when the conflict ended. When the war was over and American automobile production resumed in 1945 and 1946, every major manufacturer was essentially starting from where they had been in 1941. There had been no new passenger car development for 4 years. The cars that Americans drove in 1946 were pre-war designs carried forward because there was nothing else available. Buyers accepted this for a year or two because the war was over and the economy was beginning to boom, and people wanted cars regardless of whether they were the latest designs. But by 1948 and 1949, and certainly by 1950, the expectation was that manufacturers would bring genuinely new cars to market. Cars that reflected the prosperity of the post-war era, the confidence of the post-war era, the sense that America had won the war and was now building something extraordinary in the peace. The cars that defined that moment, the cars that are still celebrated today as icons of American automotive design, were bold, exuberant, expressive in a way that pre-war design had not been. Long hoods, sweeping lines borrowed from aircraft design, chrome used liberally and with confidence, fins beginning to appear on rear fenders, interiors that were comfortable and modern and surrounded the driver with a sense of occasion. General Motors, under the design leadership of Harley Earl, was producing cars that looked like the future. Ford was responding with its own dramatic designs. Packard's response to this moment was cautious, conservative. The 1948 Packard was a well-engineered car and a dignified car, but it looked to many eyes like a car that was afraid of the new era rather than embracing it. The body had an upright formality that had served the company well for decades, but now read, next to what GM and Ford were doing, as old-fashioned. People began calling Packards pregnant elephants, not a term of endearment. The proportions that had once communicated gravitas were now communicating something less flattering. This was a solvable problem. GM solved it with Harley Earl. Chrysler solved it with Virgil Exner. Every major manufacturer of the post-war era understood that design was now a competitive weapon and invested accordingly. Packard did not invest accordingly. The company had money problems that prevented it from making the kinds of capital investments in new tooling and new dies and new manufacturing processes that a genuinely competitive new design required. Those money problems were partly a legacy of the Depression years, partly a result of the post-war reconversion costs, and partly a result of the fact that Packard was a relatively small company trying to compete in a market that rewarded scale. Because here was the fundamental structural problem that no one at Packard had fully solved. The company existed in a strange space in the market. It was too large to be a pure, low-volume, ultra-luxury manufacturer. It could not operate the way Rolls-Royce operated, making a small number of exquisite cars for an extremely wealthy clientele and pricing them to reflect the craft involved. And it was too small and too expensive to compete with General Motors and Ford on volume. It was caught in the middle, not quite one thing and not quite the other, and getting more caught as the decade wore on. The one decision that might have changed the trajectory was a potential merger with Nash Kelvinator, another independent manufacturer, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. A combined Packard-Nash entity would have had more scale, more resources, more engineering capability to throw at the problem of competing with the Big Three. The merger discussions went on for years. They ultimately failed, for reasons that included corporate ego and disagreements about control and the basic difficulty of combining two companies with different cultures and different customer bases. Instead, in 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker. This is the merger that ended Packard as a real thing, though it took 2 more years for the reality to become undeniable. Studebaker was a proud old company, older than Packard, with roots going back to horse-drawn wagons in the 1850s. But by 1954, it was in serious financial trouble. Its manufacturing costs were too high, its labor relations were difficult, and its market position was weak. The idea behind the Packard-Studebaker merger was that combining the two companies would create an independent manufacturer with enough scale to survive in an industry increasingly dominated by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler.